The ancient Roman Empire is usually remembered for its glorious military conquests. We think of brave gladiators, brilliant generals, and massive marble temples. But while everyone else was busy stabbing each other with swords, one man was getting rich. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the absolute richest man in Roman history. He basically invented modern, ruthless corporate capitalism over 2,000 years ago. Crassus realized very early on that simply winning battles did not make you a billionaire. He knew that the real, ultimate power was always found in real estate and debt. To understand his genius, you have to understand what the city of Rome actually looked like. Rome was a massive, incredibly overcrowded metropolis filled with millions of people. Most of these people lived in very cheap, highly dangerous wooden apartment buildings. These tall wooden buildings were called insulae, and they were built dangerously close to each other. There were absolutely no building codes, no safety regulations, and no public services. Because of this, devastating and terrifying fires broke out almost every single day. For a normal Roman citizen, a fire was a complete, life-destroying financial tragedy. But for Marcus Crassus, a raging city fire was a fantastic, highly profitable business opportunity. He looked at the burning city and realized there was no official fire department, so he simply decided to create the first private, highly organized fire brigade in history. He went to the slave markets and bought a massive army of exactly 500 men. He trained them perfectly and bought buckets, water pumps, and heavy demolition equipment. But Crassus was absolutely not doing this out of the goodness of his heart. When a building caught on fire, his private brigade rushed to the scene immediately. But when they arrived, they completely refused to throw a single drop of water on the fire. Instead, Crassus stood directly in front of the burning building holding a legal contract. He offered to buy the burning house right there on the spot from the crying owner. But he offered a ridiculously, insultingly low price for the burning property. If the panicked owner refused the terrible offer, Crassus simply folded his arms. He watched the house completely burn to the ground while smiling and doing nothing. He also went to the owners of the houses right next door to the fire. He offered to buy their houses for pennies before the fire spread to their roof. As the hot flames got closer, the neighbors almost always panicked and signed the papers. Once the cheap contracts were officially signed, his 500 men finally went to work. They quickly put out the fire and saved his brand new, extremely cheap property. If the fire was already too big, they simply used heavy hammers to smash the building down. This stopped the fire from spreading to the rest of the neighborhood he just bought. Crassus then used his cheap slave labor to rebuild the damaged houses. He built them slightly better and immediately rented them out for massive, endless profit. He literally created a completely legal, highly aggressive real estate mafia monopoly. He repeated this exact same brutal, heartless trick hundreds and hundreds of times. Eventually, he owned a massive, terrifying percentage of the entire city of Rome. He was literally collecting monthly rent from half of the Roman population. But buying burning houses was not his only ruthless method of making money. When Crassus was a younger man, Rome was going through a violent civil war. A brutal dictator named Sulla took over the city and started executing his political enemies. Sulla published long lists of names of people who were marked for death. If your name was on the list, you were killed, and your property was confiscated by the state. Crassus saw this horrible, bloody massacre as a massive discount shopping event. He bought the confiscated estates of murdered men for absolute fractions of a penny. There are even rumors that he secretly added names to the death lists just to buy their beautiful houses. His entire fortune was literally built on the blood and ashes of his fellow citizens. Crassus also realized that slaves were the ultimate economic asset of the ancient world. But he did not just buy slaves to do simple, mindless physical labor. He bought intelligent slaves and personally trained them to be architects, readers, and managers. By educating them, he increased their market value by incredibly massive margins. He rented his highly educated slaves out to other wealthy Romans for a huge premium. He was making money from every single possible angle in the ancient economy. He became so impossibly wealthy that his net worth was equal to the entire Roman treasury. He famously joked that a man is not truly rich unless he can buy his own personal army. And very soon, he would have to do exactly that to save the entire Roman Republic. In the year 73 BC, Rome faced its most embarrassing and terrifying crisis. A gladiator named Spartacus broke out of his training camp with a few dozen men. They used kitchen knives and stolen weapons to fight their way to freedom. The Roman Senate thought this was a small, completely irrelevant local police problem. They sent a small militia to arrest Spartacus, but the gladiators absolutely crushed them. Word spread quickly, and thousands of runaway slaves joined Spartacus in the mountain. Suddenly, Spartacus had a massive, highly motivated army of angry men. They started destroying professional Roman legions sent to stop them. Rome was in an absolute state of pure, unprecedented panic and total terror. The invincible Roman army was being humiliated by a group of escaped slaves. The government desperately needed a savior, but all their best generals were busy fighting in other countries. Marcus Crassus saw this national disaster as the ultimate opportunity for political power. He offered to take command of the war and crush Spartacus once and for all. But the government was completely broke and could not afford to pay for new soldiers. So Crassus simply opened his own personal wallet and paid for everything himself. He literally bought a massive army of 40,000 men out of his own pocket. He marched out to face Spartacus, but his new soldiers were terrified of the gladiators. In their first battle, a group of Roman soldiers threw down their weapons and ran away in fear. Crassus knew he had to establish absolute, terrifying discipline immediately. He brought back an ancient, horrific Roman military punishment called decimation. He took the cowardly soldiers and divided them into groups of 10 men. They were forced to draw straws, and the loser in each group was chosen to die. The other 9 men were forced to beat their own friend to death with heavy wooden clubs. It was an incredibly brutal, psychological tactic to ensure absolute obedience. Crassus wanted his soldiers to be far more terrified of him than they were of Spartacus. The horrific strategy actually worked, and the Roman army stopped running away. Crassus slowly and methodically pushed Spartacus into the southern tip of Italy. He trapped the slave army and starved them out with massive defensive walls. In the final, bloody battle, Spartacus was completely defeated and killed in the mud. Crassus had won the war and saved the entire Roman Republic from absolute humiliation. To send a permanent, terrifying message, Crassus took 6,000 surviving slaves. He crucified every single one of them along the famous Appian Way. For over 100 miles, the road to Rome was lined with dead and dying men. It was a gruesome, horrific display of his absolute wealth, power, and cruelty. Crassus expected a massive, glorious triumph and the eternal love of the Roman people. But history is incredibly unfair, and geopolitics is deeply cynical. Another famous Roman general named Pompey was returning from a war in Spain. Pompey intercepted a small, broken group of slaves running away from Crassus. Pompey killed them and immediately wrote a letter to the Roman Senate. He claimed that while Crassus fought some battles, it was Pompey who truly ended the war. The Roman people loved Pompey, so they gave him all the massive glory and credit. Crassus was absolutely furious, deeply insulted, and intensely jealous. He had spent his own massive fortune to save Rome, but Pompey stole the spotlight. This bitter jealousy would literally define the rest of his entire life. Despite having all the money in the known world, Crassus was deeply insecure. He realized that in Rome, money could buy power, but it could not buy legendary respect. Only military glory and conquering foreign lands could make you a true Roman god. Crassus and Pompey hated each other, but they were the 2 most powerful men in Rome. They needed a middleman, someone highly charismatic to balance their massive egos. Enter a young, incredibly ambitious, and completely broke politician named Julius Caesar. Caesar was a brilliant speaker and a rising star, but he owed massive debts to everyone. He owed so much money that he could not even leave the city without being arrested. Crassus saw Caesar as the perfect, highly useful political investment. Crassus opened his endless wallet again and completely paid off all of Caesar's massive debt. He funded Caesar's political campaigns, buying votes and bribing officials across the city. In return, Caesar helped negotiate a massive secret alliance between Crassus and Pompey. This secret alliance became known to history as the First Triumvirate. These 3 men, a billionaire, a famous general, and a charismatic politician, took over Rome. They completely bypassed the Senate and ruled the Republic from the dark shadows. They divided the empire's massive resources and provinces among themselves. For a few years, the 3 men were absolutely unstoppable and completely untouchable. But the delicate balance of power slowly started to violently shift. Julius Caesar went to Gaul, which is modern-day France, to fight a massive war. Over the next decade, Caesar conquered millions of people and became unbelievably rich. Caesar became a legendary military hero, loved by the troops and the common people. Pompey was also given massive control over Spain and was highly respected. Crassus was sitting in Rome, getting older, richer, but feeling completely left behind. He was the financial backing of the entire operation, but he had no modern military glory. He was still just known as the greedy landlord who bought burning wooden houses. Crassus simply could not handle being the least famous man in the room. He desperately wanted a massive military triumph that would overshadow Caesar and Pompey. He needed a war, but there were no obvious, easy enemies left to fight. So, at the age of 60, Crassus decided to manufacture a completely unnecessary war. He looked all the way to the east, toward the incredibly powerful Parthian Empire. Parthia was located in modern-day Iran and was massive, rich, and highly dangerous. Rome actually had a peaceful treaty with Parthia, and there was no reason to attack them. The Roman Senate strongly advised against the war, calling it illegal and incredibly stupid. But Crassus did not care about treaties, laws, or logical military strategy. He wanted to be the man who conquered the East and stole all their massive gold. He used his unbelievable wealth to raise another massive private army of 7 legions. That was roughly 40,000 heavily armored, highly trained Roman foot soldiers. He marched his massive, expensive army toward the endless hot deserts of the Middle East. He was warned by local kings to stick to the mountains, where water was plentiful. They warned him that the open desert was a complete death trap for slow Roman infantry. But Crassus was arrogant, incredibly impatient, and thought his money made him invincible. He ignored all professional military advice and marched directly into the flat, dry sand. He wanted the fastest route to the Parthian cities to steal their treasure. It was the absolute worst military decision in the history of the ancient world. Waiting for him in the deep desert was a brilliant Parthian general named Surena. Surena did not have a massive army of slow, heavy foot soldiers like the Roman. Instead, he had about 10,000 highly mobile, incredibly fast horse archers. The Parthians were famous for riding fast, shooting arrows backwards, and riding away. This deadly hit-and-run tactic was literally called the Parthian shot. When the two armies finally met near the town of Carrhae, the heat was absolutely unbearable. The Roman soldiers were exhausted, thirsty, and wearing heavy metal armor in the sun. Crassus formed his men into a massive, tightly packed defensive square. He assumed the Parthians would quickly run out of arrows, and then the Romans could fight. But the Parthian general Surena was a tactical genius who brought a logistical cheat code. He brought a massive train of 1,000 camels, completely loaded with endless arrows. The horsemen simply rode in circles around the slow Roman square, firing endlessly. When they ran out of arrows, they went to the camels, reloaded, and kept shooting. It was a horrific, never-ending storm of sharp metal raining down on the Romans. The heavy Roman shields and armor were completely useless against the powerful bow. The Roman soldiers could not fight back because they could not catch the fast horses. They just stood in the hot sand and slowly died for hours and hours. Crassus watched in absolute horror as his incredibly expensive army was slowly destroyed. His own son, Publius Crassus, led a desperate cavalry charge to break the enemy line. But Publius was quickly surrounded, trapped, and completely slaughtered by the Parthians. The enemy cut off his son's head, put it on a spear, and paraded it in front of Crassus. It was a moment of absolute psychological destruction for the richest man in Rome. As night fell, the Parthians retreated, leaving thousands of dead Romans in the sand. Crassus was completely broken, depressed, and incapable of giving any military orders. His surviving officers had to drag him away in the dark, trying to escape the desert. But the Parthians easily tracked them down the very next day. General Surena offered to meet with Crassus to discuss a peaceful surrender. Crassus knew it was a trap, but his desperate, angry soldiers forced him to go. During the meeting, a sudden violent scuffle broke out, and Crassus was captured alive. The mighty billionaire landlord was now a dirty, defeated prisoner of war. The Parthians knew exactly who they had captured in the desert. They knew all about his massive real estate scams and his endless thirst for money. They knew he had invaded their peaceful country just to steal their treasure. So, the Parthian leaders decided to give him an incredibly fitting, legendary punishment. According to historical legends, they melted down a large pile of solid gold coins. They held the struggling, terrified billionaire down on the hot desert floor, and they poured the boiling, liquid, molten gold directly down his throat. They told him that since his thirst for gold was endless in life, it should be satisfied in death. The man who bought half of Rome finally choked on his own ultimate, literal greed. His severed head was later used as a stage prop in a play for the Parthian king. The Battle of Carrhae was one of the most embarrassing, devastating defeats in Roman history. Over 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed, and 10,000 were taken as slaves. But the death of Marcus Crassus had an even more massive, terrifying geopolitical impact. He was the financial glue that held the secret alliance together. Without Crassus balancing the massive egos of Caesar and Pompey, the triumvirate collapsed. Julius Caesar and Pompey almost immediately turned on each other in a violent civil war. That civil war ultimately destroyed the Roman Republic forever. It paved the way for Julius Caesar to become a dictator and end the old system. So, in a weird, twisted way, Crassus bought the end of the Roman Republic. His life remains the ultimate, timeless blueprint for corporate sharks and greedy monopolies. He proved that you can literally buy an army, buy a city, and buy a government. He showed that every crisis, even a burning house, is just another business opportunity. But his horrific death also proved a timeless, fundamental rule of history. You can have all the money, power, and real estate in the entire world, but pride, arrogance, and a desire for fame will eventually lead you into the desert. Crassus died in the dirt, far from his burning wooden houses and his piles of cash. His name is barely remembered as a hero, but always remembered as a warning that absolute, unchecked greed will eventually consume you from the inside out. And that is the incredible, absurd, and bloody story of Rome's first true oligarch.